In 1964, a woman was murdered outside her apartment building in New York, and the story of her death became one of the most repeated facts in the history of psychology. 38 witnesses, the story goes, watched or heard the attack from their windows. Not one of them called the police in time. Not one of them came outside. For decades, this single case explains something dark about human nature, that in a crowd, we quietly assume someone else will help, and so nobody does. Except the story, the one taught in nearly every psychology textbook for 50 years, was never actually true. Her name was Kitty Genovese. She was 28, a bar manager, walking home from work at 3 in the morning. A man named Winston Moseley attacked her in 3 separate assaults over roughly half an hour. 2 weeks later, the New York Times ran a story with a headline that would outlive everyone involved. 37 witnesses saw the killing and did nothing. The number changed slightly depending on who was retelling it, 37, 38, but the moral of the story never moved an inch. This was proof of something the article called the appalling indifference of city life. Psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley read that story and built an entire field of research on top of it. They called it the bystander effect, the idea that the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely any single person is to help, because responsibility quietly spreads thin across the crowd until it disappears completely. It became one of the most famous findings in social psychology. Students have been taught it for 2 generations. It shows up in true crime shows, in comic books, in at least one HBO series. And underneath all of it sat a reporting error nobody bothered to check for 40 years. In 2007, 3 researchers, Rachel Manning, Mark Levine, and Alan Collins, published a paper in American Psychologist that went back to the original police files, trial transcripts, and interviews. What they found did not match the legend at all. The assistant district attorney who prosecuted the case later said they could only find about half a dozen people who had actually seen anything. Most of the so-called witnesses had heard something in the middle of the night, a scream, a scuffle, and assumed it was a drunken argument or a couple fighting, the kind of noise a city makes every night that nobody investigates. At least one person did call the police during the attack. And when Moseley first grabbed her, a neighbor shouted down from a window and told him to leave her alone. He ran. He came back only because nobody followed up, not because nobody cared. In 2016, the New York Times itself published a follow-up admitting its own original story had been, in its words, flawed. Not exaggerated by accident. Flawed. The reporters had taken a police commissioner's offhand comment at a lunch meeting and turned it into a number that was never actually verified against the case file. So here's the strange part. The bystander effect itself, the psychological phenomenon, turned out to be real. Latané and Darley ran their own lab experiments afterward, and they found something genuinely unsettling. In one study, they put a person alone in a room filling out a survey and slowly pumped smoke in through a vent. Alone, most people got up and reported it within 2 minutes. But when the same person sat in a room with 2 strangers who had secretly been told to ignore the smoke, only 10% of people reported it at all, even as the room filled with haze thick enough to make it hard to see the paper in front of them. The effect is genuine. It's been replicated dozens of times. What was fake was the story used to introduce it to the world. And that's the part that should actually bother you. An entire generation of students learned this concept through a lie about specific people, 38 named human beings, most of whom never existed as described, condemned for decades as the face of urban cruelty for a crime most of them didn't actually witness. We built a moral lesson on the backs of people who, as far as the record shows, mostly just heard a noise in the night the way city noise always sounds like something and almost never is. It's a strange kind of injustice, being remembered as a villain in a psychology class for something you may have never done, and it raises an uncomfortable question about every viral story you've ever heard used to explain something dark about human nature. How many of them got checked? How many of them just felt true, matched a fear people already had about crowds, about strangers, about cities, and so nobody looked twice? The real lesson buried under 50 years of a wrong headline isn't that people are cruel in groups, though sometimes they are. It's that we are remarkably willing to believe the worst about a crowd of strangers based on a single, unverified newspaper article, and remarkably unwilling to go back and check once that story has already done the job of confirming what we suspected all along. Kitty Genovese has a real story. It just isn't the one that made her famous. She had a neighbor who ran outside to hold her as she was dying. That detail didn't make the headline. It never does. The story that spreads is rarely the one that's true. It's the one that's satisfying. And for 50 years, we mistook the difference for a scientific fact.